Okay, good afternoon, or actually it's good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for a public meeting regarding NOACA's new highway interchange project policy. Next slide, please. I'm Grace Gallucci. I'm Executive Director, CEO of NOACA. Next slide, please. Most of you who are attending probably are familiar with NOACA's role, or you may not have come to join us this evening. But for those of you that are new, let me tell you a little bit about NOACA. Next slide, please. NOACA is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Greater Cleveland. We represent 5 counties: Cuyahoga, Geauga, Lake, Lorraine, and Medina, and we're responsible for multimodal transportation and environmental planning. We are governed by 46 elected and appointed officials, and we have a mandate from the federal government both to plan as well as to allocate resources for transportation projects that are federally funded. Also, we do not implement projects on our own. Our projects are only implemented in partnership with many of you throughout the region. Relative to transportation planning, NOACA emphasizes the 3C planning process: comprehensive, cooperative, and continuing. And this is for the development, funding, and implementation of the transportation system. Our major planning effort, which is currently underway, is the development of our long-range transportation plan. NOACA's vision is very simply stated that we will strengthen regional cohesion, preserve existing infrastructure, and build a sustainable multimodal transportation system to support economic development and enhance the quality of life. And that takes us to why we are here this evening. So NOACA has been working on a policy regarding the approval of highway interchanges for about a year now. And that policy was presented in its draft form at the policy committee in October and will be presented to our board of directors in December. And as part of our overall planning process, we want to bring public awareness and allow for engagement into this process. Essentially, 2 components of this process for this evening. One is education. We'd like to explain to you the details of the policy. And then 2 is the solicitation of feedback. Once we tell you about the policy, we'd like you to tell us what you think of it. And essentially, we're hoping to create an understanding that the policy is intended to guide good planning. It is not a policy that is intended to prohibit or restrict plans or projects. We simply want to ensure that as we move forward with an interchange project, that the benefits outweigh the costs. As an MPO, NOACA has both the authority and the responsibility to formulate policies associated with transportation land use in order to ensure that the public interest is both served and protected. This allows us to have a high level of transparency as we want to ensure integrity and upholding of the public trust throughout our processes, not just in the highway interchange policy, but in our long-range planning process, TIP, and so many other things that we do. In representing the public interest around interchange and why we have thought about developing this policy, well, let's take a step back. Interchanges are an integral part of the transportation system, right? Increase mobility and access, improve congestion and safety, and spur economic development are all aspects of why an interchange would be requested, why an interchange would be desired in a community. Those are all very positive things. So we move that a little bit farther and say, well, as we want to establish a highway interchange policy, that policy provides for a more unified and efficient approach to long-term planning for the entire transportation system, and then specifically allocating resources towards that effective implementation. It provides for the evaluation and prioritization of interchange projects in coordination with all the decision makers in the region, including the municipal level, the county level, the regional level, and the state agencies. So establishing a highway interchange policy is for us to be more efficient and effective of the deployment of our transportation responsibilities, and to do so in a way that is coordinated with the other decision makers. So why the need for a highway project interchange policy in more detail? Very specifically in the Northeast Ohio region, there has been a recent surge for the propositions of new interchanges or modified interchange projects in the region. And what do we mean by a surge? We have 8 of them currently having been submitted for us to start reviewing them. And this really has been the first time since the Nagel interchange in Avon has sort of evolved to this level of seriousness with regard to moving forward. And during that particular evaluation, there was a lot of lessons learned, and we want to make sure that those lessons learned are carried forward into the new evaluations of these proposals. And again, we want to provide the framework for a coordinated and transparent approach. And based on the authority that we have as a metropolitan planning organization, which is under federal regs, we have that authorization that allows us to develop that policy in order to evaluate and make decisions on regional project proposals. The policy builds on an existing programmatic policy, but it much more specifically proposes projects must satisfy both the transportation planning criteria and the regional impacts criteria for placement in NOACA's long-range plan. And when we say satisfy both, we're really talking about having the opportunity to evaluate both and describe what that quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis looks like to the decision makers. So coming to us both for that very technical criteria and then also for the regional impacts criteria evaluation. And ultimately what we're saying is that the project, the interchange, must provide a net benefit for the entire region over the long term, not just over the short term and not just for the site jurisdiction, meaning that we want to evaluate the interchange to ensure that not only the community that asks for the interchange benefits, but the entire region. And generally that is the intended outcome for many who request interchanges. So I don't think this really steps outside of those bounds much. But as we're also evaluating, we want to allow for this process to unfold. We want to allow for further analysis as well as public input, so we can take into consideration what effects or impacts the development could bring to communities. Essentially talking about the interchange and the proximity of the interchange to other aspects of the transportation system and overall quality of life, connecting people to jobs and so forth. So the new interchange policy will coordinate comprehensive examination of those impacts. Transportation planning, fiscal responsibility, economic development, environmental protection, safety, and quality of life are all included as part of this new policy. And again, I want to emphasize that we are defining the impact beyond the site and temporal beyond the date of the project completion. So we're looking at more than just one jurisdiction, and we are looking at more than short term. We are looking at the entire life cycle of the interchange. We believe that proper planning is necessary, and without planning and a coordinated framework around interchanges could become ineffective, underutilized, out of place with cluttered signs, haphazard land use and traffic congestion, things that are really not looked very good upon either by the motorist or the landowner, as well as local officials and residents. And so we're really trying to avoid a misaligned or unnecessary spending of limited resources. These are taxpayer dollars, and we want to ensure that they go to the highest and best use. Next. So very quickly, what you need to know about the policy, I'll give you the highlights, and then I'm going to ask for our two experts in the field on this topic to give you more detail. So most quickly, you probably want to know, what does it do? What does it not do? And how does it work? So what does the policy do? These are a couple of highlights that we called for do's and don'ts based on questions we've already received. So these are not exhaustive lists, but they're intended to give you some very clear guidance on what it is and what it isn't. So what does the policy do? Does it promote net benefits for the region? Yes. Does it provide fair and equitable access for the region? Yes. Drive more efficient, effective, and equitable use of resources? Yes. Facilitate mobility consistent with positive economic goals to create thriving communities? Yes. Ensure maintenance and highway modifications are part of a coordinated plan of action? Yes. Evaluate long-term benefits and costs, even opportunity costs, to assess impacts on connecting communities? Yes. Again, not just the community it's in, the connecting communities as well. Facilitates coordination amongst the principal planning agencies and the project sponsors? Yes. Provides due process for all interchanges to be evaluated consistently? Yes. And I would like to emphasize that one. Essentially, we're saying that all interchanges should be looked at with the same level of study that others are. That we should not be looking at one in a more technical way, or another in a more political way, or another in a more systematic way. They all need to have the same level of evaluation, albeit there are often uniquenesses to each of those interchanges, which we address as well and allow for some flexibility. Next slide. So then, what doesn't the policy do? Want to be clear here, the population, and again, these are put up here based on questions we've received or comments we've received. It is not exhaustive, but want to give you a flavor for, does the policy relocate populations from one area of Northeast Ohio to another area? The answer is no. That is not the objective of the policy. That is not what we are looking to accomplish. Does it favor or promote one particular part of Northeast Ohio over another? No. Absolutely not. It's quite the opposite. We're wanting to treat all areas of the region in a very equitable way. Does it prohibit suburban growth? No, we're not trying to stall growth that is appropriate. We just want to ensure that an interchange, again, is looking at that long-term sustainability, both financial and otherwise, as well as for a regional benefit. Does it support big business or policymakers over residents? No, it doesn't support any particular stakeholder in the process other than the taxpayer. And that's what we're looking at, is overall residents, businesses, all folks are important in the process. And we're looking to give a clear evaluation of how those impacts would be accepted by those folks. Create environmental justice impacts affecting minority, low income, and special populations? No. Environmental justice impacts, for those of you that are not familiar, are negative. We are not wanting to create any negative impacts. Quite the opposite. We want to ensure that negative impacts are not going to be absorbed by those minority, low income, or special populations. And lastly, this policy does not promote traffic congestion or delays. Where that comes from, or folks are fearing that if they cannot put in interchanges, it would cause traffic congestion and delays. We are the agency of eliminating traffic congestion and delays. So this policy does not support or promote any traffic congestion or delays. So those are some highlights. When we talk about policy criteria, next slide, please. We have two very critical aspects of the criteria. One is the transportation planning, the very technical aspects of whether or not an interchange is warranted based on traffic analysis and such, which does include a cost benefit analysis. And then the local and regional impacts. And those are the two things that will be discussed. I will first ask Dr. Ali Makarachi, our Director of Transportation Planning and Engineering, to talk to us about the transportation planning first and second tier criteria, and then ask Joe McDonald, our Director of Long Range and Strategic Planning, to talk about the local and regional impacts. I also want to emphasize that Dr. McDonald is also a project manager for our long range plan, which we have looked at in a much more global way, integrating some of the things that we're talking about, like economic development, housing, land use, etc. And so we are looking at evaluating all of the interchanges against the specified criteria and ensuring coordination amongst the sponsors. I'd have to say those two things are our primary objectives. And so with that, Dr. Makarachi, I turn it over to you.
Good evening. Thank you, Chris. Next, please. Yeah, okay. Now, we look at this graph. I'm showing this graph because it's important how we access the transportation system in general. We access transport system for the mobility reason to go from location A to location B. But I'll give you one example. For example, air transportation. Air transportation is very easy because once you are at the airport, you are in access mode. Once you go to the inside the cabin and cabin door is closed, then you are in a mobility mode. So that's very clear. Where is access? Is a binary access and mobility. But transportation, land transportation is not like that. It's difficult to say where we have got access, how much access we have got, how much mobility we should have. For example, in your neighborhood cul-de-sac roads, the main purpose is the access. But other side of the spectrum is the freeway. Then for the freeway, when you access the freeway, your purpose and the main purpose is to go for a mobility. So that's why, but sometimes it's difficult. How much arterial, how much collectors access, how much mobility, and where do we access the freeway, for example, through these interchanges? That's difficult in terms of it's not like easy, like, as I mentioned, the air transportation. Next, please. Okay, when we say interchange, basically we have got two types of interchange. One is a complete interchange, and the other one is a partial interchange. Complete interchange means you have got all this access, and from any direction you can go to any other 3 other directions in whether it's a arterial or freeway to freeway. Partial interchange has got some of these movements are missing. For example, there's got 2 ramps, and that's a partial interchange. It's not 4 ramps, or it's not all this interchange, all this access. Next, please. Okay, so this policy applies to basically interchange reconfigurations at the existing locations. Change interchange type, partial to full maybe, add ramps, relocate ramp terminal to different roads, significant operational changes like collector and distributor roads. These are the main, the policy will apply. Next, please. Now, when we look at that, as Grace mentioned, we are looking at different criteria. First one, interchange spacing. That's important for the safety, mobility purposes, as I mentioned, how we're gonna access to this system, and traffic management. And usually what we say in terms of the traffic engineering, we have got the document called Green Book, and that's the AASHTO, American Association of the Highway Transport official design guide. We have to follow that guide for the interchange spacing. Next, please. The first year interchange spacing. Minimum interchange spacing for the arterial interchange should be determined by interchange form, lane configuration, viewing volumes. For example, somebody joining merging to the freeway, the other one leaving the freeway. How far this distance should be to be a safe entrance and safe exit. Signing, how far we have to have a signing. Signal progression and length of the speed lane change lanes. Next, please. Now, all this I said, but Ashto, the green book I mentioned, suggests the following general guideline. Minimum of the 1 mile spacing in urban areas and minimum of 2 mile spacing in rural areas. But the life and the actual project are not that easy to measure it and say 1 mile or 2 miles. Sometimes actual spacing might vary based on very different conditions. Now, next, please. This is the existing interchange, and what you see blue circles are the 1 mile in the urban areas, and the red circles are the 2 miles distance around each interchange. We have got, this is existing, the 1 mile and 2 miles of the rural and urban areas, the buffer interchange distance. Next, please. But at the same time, we have to say this policy is not intended to apply to the following proposed interchange modification. For example, install signal at ramp intersections. That policy is not for that specific project. Extend turn lane lengths on an exit ramp or crossroad. Is not for the main line through lane additions. This policy is not for improving roadway features to meet current geometric standards and add ramp metering. This policy is not for those minor changes. Alter the number of and type of the lanes at crossroad. Road diets. Add an auxiliary lane between 2 adjacent interchange ramps. This policy is not for these kind of projects. Next, please. Okay, when we talk about, as Chris mentioned, the cost and benefit analysis, we have to look at the macro level and macroscopic level we look at our region, and then because these are usually the interchanges are investment, and this is for the next 20, 25 years. So we have to look at the relation between the average speed rates, density, and traffic flow. And what we use our NOACA travel forecasting model. We use highway capacity manual. If you are familiar with the traffic, is similar to the AASHTO, another the reference document. So we use this to look at the macro level in terms of the benefit and cost. But next, please, how do we say? When we say benefit, Chris mentioned the congestion. We look at how much actually that interchange will save in terms of the congestion cost, safety cost, in terms of how much we save in terms of the emission cost. These are our benefit of this interchange, adding the interchange to the system. And on the other hand, we have got the cost, preliminary engineering cost, right-of-way cost, construction engineering cost, operation and maintenance for the life of the interchange, probably 25 years, and those are costs. These are the one side of the equation, the other side is the benefit. Next, please. When you say congestion cost, we look at the travel delay due to congestion. When you get stuck in the freeway and that's the delay, and that's basically you're losing based on you're losing your time and you're basically money because of your value of your time. Wasted fuel due to congestion. Again, when you get stuck, you burn the fuel and you paid for it, so that's the cost. We have to do some saving there. Severity and frequency of crashes. That's another one. We use National Safety Council's measures, CAPCO they call it, and see how much we save. Then emission cost. We use software called MOVES, which is basically looks at all pollutants and all type of vehicles to see how much this interchange will save. Next, please. These are all at macro level, but at the same time, we propose to look at the micro level. Micro level, basically, rather than adding to the field, we can add on a computer, we can simulate in the software, visualize the operations, performance of the freeway interchange, surrounding streets, see what happens to traffic. If we add this with some, we have got the demand from the macro level, then we can simulate this and see what's the situation with if we add the interchange. Now I ask Joe to carry on, look at the local and regional impact criteria.
Thank you, Ali. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joe McDonald, glad to be here and happy to share with you some more insight into another set of impacts that Grace already mentioned, and that is how we look at local and regional impacts beyond just traffic engineering and strict transportation quantitative analysis. So you've seen these particular goals before. In the NOACA Regional Transportation Improvement Policy, or Investment Policy rather, we have an overall policy, and it highlights the agency's transportation plan goals. And these are the same goals that comprise the vision statement that Grace read earlier in this presentation. And I'll repeat them again because they're important. And each of these goals comes with a set of objectives that we used as the foundation for the criteria to examine a proposed highway interchange project's local and regional impacts. And those goals are strengthen regional cohesion, preserve existing infrastructure, build sustainable multimodal transportation system, support economic development, enhance quality of life. What I'm going to do now is walk you through the different objectives that are under each of these goals, and to just pull out some highlights of which objectives we think matter the most when we're looking at these criteria, because some of the objectives are not as pertinent to this kind of analysis. And then for a sample of those objectives, give you some actual examples of questions we might ask, data we might gather when we conduct our analysis. So the first goal, strengthen regional cohesion, has a set of objectives that you see. And the staff conducted an analysis to determine whether we thought that particular objective was pertinent to the interchange policy. For most of these goals, or for most of these objectives under this goal, we did not think that they were pertinent, but there were two that we did. One is ensure infrastructure investments are planned and implemented to maximize transportation benefits across all impacted communities. And another is to promote infrastructure investments that enhance the interrelationships of communities within the region. And I want you to think a moment about promote infrastructure investments that enhance the interrelationships of communities within the region, because there are some questions that staff have developed as part of our rubrics to actually analyze how this or how a particular highway interchange project might perform. Examples include the number of jobs that may move due to the interchange, because typically interchanges are associated with proposed development. Some of those jobs may be already in the region in another location, but that a company or a store or an employer may relocate to where the new interchange is proposed. The change in travel time to the jobs that move due to the interchange. So if the jobs move to a different location, how will that affect people and their commute? And then another example is change in community income tax, both the short and long term. So as jobs move, so do income taxes change in the communities that both receive the new development and those from which the development leaves. So that's just an example. The next goal, preserve existing infrastructure objectives. Here we thought all of the objectives were pertinent to the interchange policy. And I'm not going to talk about each of these objectives, but I'd like to pick out the first one that you see, or rather, it's actually the second one. Facilitate improvements that connect existing activity centers and reinvigorate existing communities. So some of the questions that we asked that serve as the rubrics to actually analyze a proposal based on this objective: will the proposed interchange stimulate development on previously developed but currently underutilized land? And if yes, how many acres? And what we're talking about here is is it possible that the interchange is going to be in an area where there used to be development, but the land is now vacant? It's no longer utilized as it was in the past. And is this an opportunity to put that land back to productive use and to generate local revenue? Another part of this assessment is how many of these acres qualify as brownfields, because that is something important to think about. Do we have an opportunity to clean up and redevelop an existing brownfield so that it becomes not an environmental blight on the region, but an opportunity for new development to generate income and jobs? Also, is the proposed interchange within 1 mile of an existing jobs hub? So there are areas in Northeast Ohio that are currently hubs for lots of jobs, and we need to ask whether the interchange is close to an existing or a developing jobs hub so that it would promote people's ability to travel and commute to the jobs in that region and potentially increase the jobs at that hub. The third goal, sustainable multimodal system objectives, our goal is to develop a sustainable multimodal system in Northeast Ohio. The objectives, there are lots of them, so they're on 2 screens. You can see them here. Let's look at this first page. All of these objectives we felt were pertinent to assess a proposed interchange project. And let's look at the first one, enhance and improve coordination for public transit, rail, pedestrian, and bicycle transportation. So this essentially is captured by the word multimodal. We want something that's going to be good not just for cars, but potentially promote development that could lead to other forms of transportation as well. It may not be intuitive that an interchange is going to facilitate other modes of transportation, but the development pattern that may come with an interchange may support that, or we may find that the interchange itself may pull development away from an area where people have the option to walk or ride a bike or take public transportation to reach their destination. So we would want to ask, is there going to be a change in public transit service to or within the influence area of the proposed interchange, including existing and proposed transit stops, park and ride facilities, et cetera. Another question is, will there be changes to the bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure? It's possible that an interchange may lead to further investment in other types of transportation infrastructure, such as bike paths, sidewalks, crosswalks, et cetera, that may actually promote more types of transportation modes within a particular area. So that's something that we want to think about. If we look at the next slide, not all of these we thought were pertinent to the interchange policy, but many of them we did. And let's look at this first objective listed here, which is integrate the control of stormwater, protection and improvement of water quality, and control of development in the floodplains. We would want to ask, as rubrics for this particular objective, is there going to be a change in impervious surface within the influence area of the proposed interchange? In other words, is this interchange going to increase the amount of pavement that could potentially increase the volume and the flashiness of stormwater runoff that may have a detrimental environmental impact? Do we have, or rather, is the influence area of the proposed interchange within a sub-watershed that is part of an area of concern? As many of you may know, there are several watersheds in Northeast Ohio that have been designated areas of concern because of past environmental degradation, and there are many efforts right now underway to lift those sub-watersheds and watersheds out of that status by indicating that we've been able to improve the quality of the water on a number of metrics, biological, aquatic life, recreational use, et cetera. Will this interchange set us back? We want to know that information. And then we want to know if the influence area of the proposed interchange is within a floodplain or a flood hazard zone. Are we going to be putting people at risk? Are we going to exacerbate the potential for flooding? That's information that's important to understand with any proposed project. The fourth goal is to support economic development. And these are the objectives under that goal. It's about split. Half we think are pertinent to examination of a policy or a proposed interchange project rather, and half perhaps not so much. And just as an example, the third objective on this list: support retention and expansion of Northeast Ohio businesses in areas with existing infrastructure and attract new businesses to Northeast Ohio. So this is important because we want to retain the businesses we have. We want to promote the expansion of businesses that already exist here. And we want to bring new businesses to the region as a part of an economic development and growth strategy. So the questions we may ask as part of our rubrics: will the proposed interchange actually maintain certain businesses? What is the expected number of retained jobs and the tax revenue associated with those jobs and the organizations that employ those people? Will the proposed interchange expand certain businesses? And again, look at how many new jobs will we see because of this interchange, and how much increased tax revenue. And then what about looking at new businesses? What is the potential for this interchange to attract new businesses to Northeast Ohio, and the jobs and subsequent revenue that those new jobs could bring? And then the final goal under our vision statement and our overall work plan here is to enhance quality of life. And we felt that all of these objectives are pertinent to examination of a proposed interchange project. And specifically, we want to call out the second objective here, which is to provide improved access to primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and other educational opportunities. So the questions we might ask, will this interchange, what will this interchange mean in terms of the change in travel time to schools that are nearby, colleges and universities that may be nearby? Will it change travel time for workers to reach colleges and universities if their job location changes because of development that depends on this proposed interchange? Does this proposed interchange enhance mode choice to reach schools, colleges, and universities, as well as other training opportunities? So what role does this interchange have in people's mobility to reach the opportunities and training programs they need to improve their socioeconomic status and increase their education? So that gives you a snapshot of the different types of analysis we could conduct based on the goals that are in NOACA's vision statement as part of their strategic plan and the objectives that support those goals. And now to recap, when we talk about proposal priorities and to move into discussion with questions from our attendees, Grace Gallucci. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baccaracci and Dr. McDonald. Those were terrific presentations and great summaries of how the process will unfold relative to the evaluation against the criteria that we have determined is relevant for ensuring that the benefits of an interchange will in fact be across the region and long lasting. As we wrap up this part of the discussion and open it up, just reiterating that each and every interchange proposal will receive a thorough examination of impacts, of its own impact, its transportation planning impact, fiscal development, economic development, environmental protection, safety, quality of life, racial equity, and others as Joe has spoken of. Again, which may go beyond that immediate life and the immediate area. So with that, I know that there are some questions already in the chat box, and Kathy Sarley is going to read those questions to us and begin the conversation. Kathy?
All right. Good evening, everyone. So this question, I believe, is for Dr. Baccaracci, and it asks, how are you taking into consideration the non-monetary costs and benefits?
Well, we quantify all this. For example, when you say, for example, as I mentioned, you're stuck in the traffic and there's a delay, how much is that delay? We can take the average income, average wages, and we can quantify that as a basically quantitative measure for the benefit and cost. So for everything, we have to make it quantitative and make it something, take an average or take some values. So we can say, how do we calculate congestion? Value of time, the driver, the delay, the fuel cost, all this is gonna be something. So we have to convert them and try to find the, benefits in terms of the how much we save. So it should be quantitative, and we try to quantify all these measures, all these variables.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Makarachi. If I may add, that we are approaching the majority of the question, the equation, like a true cost-benefit analysis that any private sector business would use. So there are ways to convert things that may not initially be viewed as monetary into its monetary equivalents. Sometimes there's proxy for those numbers. And then certainly when we go to the analysis that Joe McDonald talked about, those are probably a little harder to capture. And some of them may not be able to be captured monetarily, but in some other scientific ways. And then the idea is to try and bring forth a analysis that is as objective, data-driven as possible. And then the things that are just qualitative and maybe cannot truly be quantified, they would be integrated into that analysis and explicitly defined as such.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, they want to know, how do we measure equity?
So there's a big question, how we measure equity, and there's a lot of components within that big question. And then there are some that are very specific that Joe touched upon in his analysis. But the very basic one that we are looking at for equity is who's paying and who's benefiting. And when you talk about benefits, is it a regional benefit? What communities are benefiting? What communities are not? And the objective is for major infrastructure projects of this nature, they should benefit well beyond their immediate vicinity. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be perfect, but we will be looking at very clear information from demographics and such. And Joe, if you want to explain some of the specific calculations that we've talked about to quantify equity.
Sure. So if folks recall, I talked about one of the objectives under the Strengthen Regional Cohesion goal. That was to promote infrastructure investments that enhance the interrelationships of communities within Northeast Ohio. I touched on a few of the rubrics, but I didn't touch on all of them, so I can talk about a couple others that we have. One is to look at the change in population, both the total population and the environmental justice population within a specified commute time of the intersection location. So we want to understand whether whether there's going to be, with this new interchange, potential new development that is going to be further or less accessible to people who live in environmental justice areas, because those folks may not have as many choices when it comes to transportation to reach potential jobs, to reach stores and services, et cetera. So that's something we want to think about. Is this interchange going to potentially move development or shift development focus away from those people who have less flexibility to actually reach the new development versus other folks across the region who have those options? Another rubric under the same objective, same goal, is to consider the environmental justice population in both the leaving communities and the receiving communities. As I mentioned, interchanges are often proposed in tandem with development projects. And so we have to think about, well, if there are development projects that are going to involve the relocation of employers within the region, a shift, if you will that shift occur from communities that have a higher concentration of environmental justice population to a community that has a lower shift in environmental, or a lower number of environmental justice population. And again, it goes back to, you know, what Grace mentioned, is in that we have the potential with these shifts in jobs and development. Is it going to take away tax revenue? Is it going to take away jobs from communities that are potentially less able to handle those losses and move those jobs and that revenue to communities that already are flush or have that? In other words, we want people to think beyond just, you know, yes, a community may benefit from an interchange, but another community may not benefit. And we want to look at the whole impact across Northeast Ohio when we do this analysis.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. The next question is, to what extent will impact on urban sprawl and disinvestment in the core urban area be considered in the evaluation?
I think to some extent Joe's answer answered that question as well. So it will be considered, and that is part of the analysis, is to determine what the negative impacts of a particular interchange implementation would be, as opposed to just the positive. And again, looking at it, yes, we'll look at it locally, but as you look at it regionally, those points may change.
Okay. I believe this one is probably already answered as well. Can you provide an example of how a project will negatively impact on jobs in another area of the region, i.e. job movement from one part of the region to another?
Right, I essentially answered that already. Want to consider whether an interchange will lead to development that involves the relocation of employers within Northeast Ohio. We want to understand that if a interchange leads to development so that an employer leaves a community to come to the community where the interchange is located, the community that loses that employer, there's a negative impact. That in terms of loss of jobs and loss of tax revenue, and that's something we want to consider. That should be part of the decision-making process, to think about that information.
Okay, next question. What is the threshold for approval? Most of these objectives seem good to uphold, but how much does a project need to meet these objectives? 80%, 90%? Does a committee check this analysis, or just internal NOACA staff?
Great question. We have not come up with a particular threshold that interchanges need to meet. I don't know if we will come up with that or not. With that still kind of pending as we finalize some of the individual items that we'll be evaluating. But my general sense is that the most important part is to have the evaluation completed and the information presented in a very transparent way. That will have the ability then to support discussions that are pro and that are perhaps not so pro. And so I think that's first and foremost. There will be no situation where an interchange could meet absolutely every criteria that we have outlined. It's just not possible. So there could not be an established 100% you must satisfy or you do not move forward. That's not the objective. That's not the what we are going for. I can't respond exactly what a percent will look like. Our first, I think, work on that is we've got these 8 interchanges and we'll take a look at them. And some of it, before we finalize what that's going to look like, if we should even put a threshold, is how far can an interchange be likely to miss or to make any of those potential thresholds. And so, again, I think a threshold is good, but it's not perfect. So we'll still need some time to work on that. But a better question or better answer to their second part of the question is, does a committee check this analysis or just internal NOACA staff? So internal NOACA staff has the responsibility to perform the analysis, particularly that component of the analysis that is more technical in nature. And when I say technical, I mean transportation planning technical as well as long-range planning technical. So we will try to quantify those and bring those to the decision makers. The decision makers start off in committee. So it is a committee that is a board structured committee. We also bring it to subcommittees and councils pending the relevance of the information and the ability for any of those councils to help to evaluate the situation and also to provide input. Then we do bring it to the committee again. If it passes through the committee, it then still must go to the NOACA board for approval. So at the end of the process, it is the NOACA board who makes the decision, not NOACA staff. It is our job simply to provide the best information we can to the board members so they're able to make a very educated decision.
Okay. Can you speak more specifically on how and where in this new process of analysis NOACA will consider effects of induced demand resulting from a new interchange?
We will, and I will turn that over to Dr. Makarachi to explain in more detail.
Well, when I said we are going to look at the cost and benefit, and one of the tools we use the travel for NOACA travel forecasting model, we are not going to run that model for today. We are going to look at the next 25 years, next 30 years, and the demand over there is going to cover all induce. We are going to look at all the growth, not just for the interchange and surrounding areas. It's going to look at the whole region, and that covers all the induce. So when we look at the one interchange and everything cost, everything is going to be based on the, say, for example, 2040 or 2045, 2050 dollars. And then we look at the demand there, how much is going to be the growth, how people are going to move. We are look at that scenario. And the model we are talking about is the NOACA model, which takes sometimes 2 days to run on a big computer. So we are simulating all these changes. We look at that. It's not just for today or any changes on this interchange.
Will this evaluation affect the schedule for approval of funds?
So the objective is not to interfere with schedules. I want to emphasize that this analysis is not simply a bureaucratic exercise to take an organization or a sponsor through. The objective is to be able to come up with information that helps us all plan better. And we would take into consideration a schedule and try to keep a project on schedule. That would be our objective. I see also that a question that you passed over, Kathy, is does NOACA have any veto over a local project that already has ODOT support? Are you reading the other way?
Oh, sorry. No, sorry. I did pass over that. Yeah.
That's okay. I've been planning my answer for that for several minutes.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. So the answer to that is that this policy does not give us any additional veto power. NOACA, as a metropolitan planning organization, has always had the veto power over interchanges or other transportation improvements, particularly those that are part of the federal aid system. So this doesn't give us any new veto. It just gives us better information for being able to make that decision. And I would also say, I don't like the word veto because the objective isn't to say, well, a community would like this interchange and then we're going to veto it. It's more, we're all going to plan together. The project sponsor, which is the local community, ODOT and NOACA, will work together to help make this this decision point. And in fact, this is probably the appropriate time to give a shout out to our colleagues over at ODOT who have been tremendously supportive and very, very helpful in looking at the components of the policy to help us determine if things are realistic or not, and especially in helping us to align the collaboration and the cooperation so that we can keep projects on schedule and we can keep them moving forward.
Okay, I will try not to skip over any. All right. Next question. Will you look at if water and sanitary is available or if the area can be served by sanitary sewer at proposed intersection as condition of approval?
So one thing that many of you may or may not know is that NOACA also is an area-wide agency, and as an area-wide, we have responsibility for approving what are called facility planning areas, and those are essentially the boundaries where a sanitary sewer can be connected to a designated management agency to process the waste. And so with or without the fact that we are responsible for that kind of analysis anyway, the answer would be yes, we would be.
All right, next question. This is a long one. When you examine the traffic impacts on influenced sub-areas, will you be modeling the long-term development patterns in these districts? More specifically, will you be taking into account the fact that some sub-areas are likely to experience new development on currently vacant land, while others are likely, based on current trends, to experience abandonment? How will you be modeling these long-term patterns?
Well, that long question is from Professor Hunter Morrison, so I would expect nothing less other than a long multi-part essay question. And as any good student, I think we should break it down into the smaller parts and answer the smaller parts. So when you examine the traffic impacts on influenced subareas, will you be modeling the long-term development patterns in these districts? Joe or Ali?
Yes, the area we are is not just sub-area, as I mentioned, all 5 counties of our region, plus 2 other counties, neighboring counties. So we are simulating all this already is in the our travel demand model. Is not just, we are not just looking at the one influence sub-area, or we are simulating all these, and these are going to be, when I talk about this model, we are talking about 95,000 links and over 40,000 nodes. These are a big network. And as I said, on a large computer, it takes 2 days sometimes to simulate all these. So we are not looking at one specific, or we are looking at whole region, even neighboring counties, to see the impact of any interchange we have, and they see benefit and cost, then calculate the benefit and cost based on those regional and sub-area impacts.
Right. Also, this is probably an appropriate point in the discussion to mention that NOACA led a development of a super regional plan several years ago called Vibrant Neo 2040. And much of the work in Vibrant Neo 2040 dealt with some of the issues that we're discussing now about, and I'm sure that's why Hunter Morrison, who was the executive director of the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium that executed the development of that plan, is probably asking this. And the answer is that we've learned a lot from conducting that planning study, and it is a very valued, award-winning study. And many of the lessons learned we have extracted from and are applying here. When we closed that study out in 2015, we were recognized by the American Planning Association as having the best regional plan in the country. And part of the reason I believe that plan was given that award was that because we had such a huge area, that was an 18 county plan. So we did it in conjunction with our colleagues in Akron, Canton, and Youngstown. But when you look at an area that large, there is no one size fits all plan. There is no one size fits all solution. So the way we designed that plan was to outline various themes, objectives, and recommendations, and that allow the local communities to determine what best fits for them and to employ those kinds of policies and or recommendations. And so that is what we're doing. And then I'll take that and say that's sort of the macrocosm. At a microcosm, similar there. We are looking at a 5-county footprint for this analysis, but they're not all treated exactly the same because they all might have different components, whether you're talking about area of land that is already developed versus undeveloped. And so they'll each have some uniquenesses to those analyses, just ensuring that it is a standardized approach to analyzing those individual areas.
Okay. Next question. Can we talk more about preserving agricultural legacy land, and are we attempting to minimize urban sprawl?
Yeah, sure. We can talk more about preserving agricultural legacy land. And that also speaks to the work of Vibrant Neo, which very much had as a element of the plan, preserving existing infrastructure and preserving agricultural land. So it's got both of the things that are critical in the discussion of interchanges here. And I will answer, I'll let one of the other two, probably Joe, talk a little bit more about the agricultural land. But what I would like to say when we say, are we attempting to minimize urban sprawl? I'm going to answer that very carefully. And we are attempting to ensure that any urban sprawl that happens is an appropriate level based on many factors. We don't want to say you're minimizing urban sprawl if in fact we get population growth of 1 million people into the region. So if you get 1 million people into the region, you may need a few interchanges. If you don't, you may not. And so I think that's kind of how you answer that question, is we are looking for appropriate solutions for appropriate growth.
Thank you, Grace. Yes, I can reiterate or remind everybody, it was on the screen momentarily, but under enhanced quality of life objectives, one of the objectives is preserve agricultural lands, open space, and important habitat areas, woodlands, and wetlands. And we have developed a set of rubrics to examine how the proposed interchange project performs on that objective, and including looking at, what current agricultural lands exist, the quality of those lands, what wetlands may exist, and there are different classifications of those wetlands. Essentially, it's really an audit of the existing land use within the area, and will the interchange and any proposed development associated with that interchange impact that existing land use, and what kinds of impacts and changes will it bring? So yes, we will look at that, definitely.
Okay, next question. What is an environmental justice area?
So an environmental justice area, environmental justice is a definition that is explicit to the federal government in defining areas that have a threshold of population that are minority, low income, or other populations such as disabled or such. And we have identified those by TAZ, Transportation Analysis Zones. And so we have a very technical analysis that takes that federal definition, uses all the census data, plots them out on a map, and those are the environmental justice areas. We intentionally did not follow what had been done previously and what is still done some places throughout the country, that may take a city and say, well, the city has a majority population that is environmental justice, therefore we'll categorize the whole city as environmental justice. Or conversely, we will categorize a part of a rural county. We will not be able to count that as environmental justice because only a small part of it is, and the rest of the county is actually one of the wealthier counties. In fact, when we do by TAZ, only those exact areas get counted as environmental justice area. And as a result, we have environmental justice areas in the rural parts of Northeast Ohio, in the urban parts, and in the suburban parts. So I think that's a very helpful way that we have designed that mapping.
Okay.
Ali, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to add what you said is so details we have got in the TAZ, the whole region, the 5 county is over 6,000 TAZ. So you can see how details this small size of the TAZ when we talk about traffic analysis zone, basically almost each neighborhood. So we look at that level of the detail in our model and the environmental justice area.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question. In accounting for the fiscal impact of new interchange on impacted communities, will you be examining likely impacts on real estate taxes as well as payroll tax revenues?
The answer is yes, although I'm not sure how much detail we'll be able to go into. That's going to remain to be seen. And surely some of these analyses will be simple, some of them not so simple. The ones that are not so simple, we will be looking for some expertise in the area of economic analysis to provide us with assistance in calculating those pieces of information.
Next question. If a project is in the pipeline, will the project be evaluated and how quickly can it occur given we are ready to move forward with the traffic modeling?
If the project is already in the pipeline, then we are very well aware of the schedule and we are very well already working with all of the parties, including the project sponsor and ODOT. To try and move the project through the analysis as quickly as possible. There's also different aspects to different projects. The ones that are sort of in the pipeline, as you say, I don't know if I would consider all 8 of them in the pipeline. I suppose they're somewhere in the pipeline, just who's to the front and who's to the back and why. If a project has been around for a long time, there's already likely been a lot of study on some of these aspects, so we won't have to go very far to get some of that information. If something is relatively newer in terms of a proposal, that would then take us to probably a much deeper analysis that has not been done before and may take longer.
Okay. Next question. Isn't the build out of more interchanges through new construction consume land and by extension reduce the possibility of density and walkability? In other words, how do we know when we have reached critical mass in interchanges, much like we have discovered with our current freeway configuration when considering current population growth or lack thereof?
Ali, did you want to take that question when we know that we have saturated the market with interchanges?
The whole point of this policy and the criteria we have got is to look at that, and we can't say, whether how many interchange we need or how many we don't need. We have to look at each one. That's what we are doing. Look at each one in terms of benefit and cost. As I said, for example, congestion, for example, the safety, are they going to be saving something or is it not? So it's difficult to say technically how many interchange we need in this area, in this region, how many we don't. We have to look at each individual as we are looking at the 8, 9 of these, and we are evaluating part of as a long range transportation plan. And that's basically the vehicle we use for evaluating these interchanges and see which one is benefiting the area. As Joe mentioned, in terms of jobs and all these impacts, which one is benefiting, which one is not benefiting. So it's not a question of, we have reached this level of the interchange number of 50, 60, that's enough. It's not like that. Maybe there's some new development and we need to add more interchange and we need to basically look at the benefit of it, and you might need the partial interchange will help. So that's my answer to the question.
Okay, are these objectives considered equally or are some weighted more strongly than others?
Well, Ali's analysis ultimately ends up in a cost-benefit analysis. So I think he integrates various components into sort of that bottom line answer. Now, when you talk about the regional criteria, Joe, what's your perspective or how would you answer that question?
Sure, thanks, Grace. Good question. I don't want folks to think about this as a formulaic approach. This is not an algorithm where we're going to plug in numbers, add things together with corresponding weights and produce a quantitative score necessarily. Our first objective, that may happen eventually, but I think more importantly, and Grace already touched on this, we want to put this kind of information in front of our boards so that they can have discussion about the merits of a project and also the potential drawbacks of a project. And I think some of these are very difficult to boil down to actual numbers. I mean, you have to think about, the impact on low-income populations or on minority communities, or what does it, how do you quantify what it means when you're potentially moving jobs from an area where people have limited ability to reach those jobs and you're pulling those jobs further away, which is one of the challenges we faced in Northeast Ohio over the past couple of decades. The increasing disconnect between where people live and the jobs that they need to improve their socioeconomic status. So it's really about getting all this information, the full breadth of scope of the review in front of the board so that they can make a better decision with that information at their disposal.
Yeah, and I'll furthermore say that this information, again, for transparency purposes, we'd like to do this kind of analysis and share it with the public, share it with the residents whose homes are near the interchange, or the community that will be using the interchange, or the community that needs the interchange, or the businesses that need the interchange. We'd like to just have that information so we can share it and have a very thoughtful conversation on how we proceed, and looking at what's best interest for the region. Certainly some people will think a certain direction is better. Some people will think another direction is better, but we are all better served if we have the opportunity to speak our minds, and speak our minds based on information that has been analyzed.
Okay, next question. As you examine the interrelationship of communities, will staff identify mechanisms such as JEDs that can address the goal of creating mutual benefits to the impacted communities?
I think I'm just going to say, Professor Morrison, you've already reached your limit of 2 questions, and so I'm going to toss out the third one. Actually, just kidding, but that's an interesting question. And again, I think Joe's point in the last answer is that we have entered uncharted territory. This is something that we are very proud of, that we're working on, because our community cares about evaluating these kinds of potential projects and ensuring that we're looking at things that make sense in the long term. So we don't have all the answers. Certainly, would I see in the future that we would be examining those interrelationships of communities? And I mean, we will be already, the answer is yes, we'll be identifying the interrelationships within communities, particularly those that utilize the interchange to connect to where they need to connect. But will we identify mechanisms in the future, such as JEDs or SEDs that can address those goals? Yeah, I think so. That would make sense.
All right. How does the proposed policy compare to those of other regional transportation planning agencies in Northeast Ohio and nationally? Are other legacy city regions adopting similar policies?
So I think I just answered that we are relatively in uncharted territory. I don't know a whole lot of communities or regions that have adopted explicit policies in the way that we have. Different regions have different pieces of the policy. Some of them have it in ways that are unspeakable here in Northeast Ohio, such as what you would see in an Oregon, and you're talking about growth boundaries and such. And then others have it sort of in a more dynamic way. So we are also looking at how to do this in a way that allows for best practices to be modeled after this. And if we can learn from best practices that exist, as well as if we can learn from lessons maybe that haven't gone as well, we will do that. We will do that too. But our very first part of this is to look at it as an information exercise. And Kathy, I think you passed over one. Right above the one you just read.
Oh, please explain and give an example of how An interchange will encourage and/or advance non-motorized vehicle usage and multimodalism.
Joe?
Yes, thank you. Good question. So this is complex in the sense that when you put an interchange in, you think primarily of automotive transportation, cars, trucks, et cetera. But there is the possibility, there are other things that could be going on. The shift in development could move people or in development away from denser, more connected mixed-use areas. So that's a potential negative impact. It is also possible that the transportation infrastructure improvement of the interchange will also include potential bike paths, potential sidewalks. The development may include crosswalks and other types of infrastructure that could improve multimodal connectivity in an area that has not previously had the development. Or maybe this is an area that used to have development, but it is currently fallow. And so this is an opportunity to revitalize a formerly developed site and include those kinds of infrastructure improvements so that if there is residential as a component, for example, in an area in proximity to the interchange, perhaps you provide internal infrastructure improvements so that people can walk and bike if they live and work within whatever development project that exists there. So it's not as simple as an interchange increases the prevalence of cars and nothing else. There is the potential, if you look at the whole breadth of the impacts, that there may be positive and negative impacts on multimodalism in other parts of Northeast Ohio, as well as in the vicinity of the interchange itself.
All right, next question. Does the long-term impact of traffic and commute times resulting from the pandemic change any of the proposed economic impact of any new interchanges?
That definitely impacts the actual traffic analysis. So I'll let Ali speak to that.
When we talk about our model and what we do is not just for, again, today, we keep updating. So when we talk about typical and the traffic pattern in the next, say, year or two, when the pattern changes, the model is going to look at that and look at all the trip generations and distribution and how the congestion is less or more. Then that's we basically dynamic approach. We do it every year and maybe sometimes every season, we look at that. So if the pandemic in the long term impacts some of the trips and some of the trip patterns, then we are going to look at that and update the model, and that's then it's going to look at the impacts of these changes in the long term.
And then relative to the economic impact, we are looking for the long term. So we hope that COVID will not be impacting much of the analysis that we're looking at. That being said, we just don't know. But I will also say there's sort of the flip side of this too, in that there might be some situations where we are looking at economic development in a way that we had not looked at it previously because of COVID, and wanting to be able to bring economic development here where it might be extremely beneficial at this point in time due to the economy.
Right. Given that our region has a net population loss, how do we justify spreading out even further?
And that's precisely the point of why we're putting this policy in place. It is very difficult to justify spreading out even further when you don't have population growth. And so we want to be able to ensure that we've got an analysis that demonstrates, considering everything, including population growth, what does the future of this interchange, how does it impact the region?
Okay. Are there examples in the last 5 years of interchange requests being denied? Under this new policy, would there be any that have been recently built, been denied?
Great question. I don't know that we've actually had an interchange request in the last 5 years. The last one I'm familiar with is the Nagel interchange in Avon, and that was about 10 or 11 years ago. and you know, the question of would some that have been approved be denied? I'm not going to speculate at this point, because there have been so many years removed that that analysis would be tough to do. And I would not want to comment on it without having a full analysis or information to be able to make that judgment.
Okay, the last thing here is not actually a question. Oh, wait, no, there is a question. Okay. Just popped up. I was going to read Hunter Morrison's compliment, but I'll read the question first. Oh, no, this is also not this is two compliments. So this is from Hunter Morrison. To all of the NOACA team, my compliments for an excellent and ambitious set of policy recommendations and for a thoughtful and informative presentation and Q&A. And then from Howard Mayer, the former executive director, he says, I don't have a question, but I would like to commend the staff and board for developing this policy proposal. This is an ambitious and systematic effort that should be helpful in the board's ability to make complex decisions. Ultimately, the decisions will be political, but it's vital to have the technical information. Congratulations for taking on this policy.
Thank you very much, Howard, for that comment, and Hunter as well, who was former board president of NOACA. You know, both of you know, over the years, NOACA has put in place very, very strong policies, very ambitious policies, has accomplished a lot under both of your tenures. So we just look at this as keep marching in a direction of making the region a better place for all to live.
So I have no more questions. I have one further comment from Councilman Brackatelli. The Nagel Interchange goes back to when I started on council 16 years ago, my first political fight. I appreciate all your efforts on this issue and your great work.
Councilman Brancatelli is also one of our board members. And actually, I think I saw not only Councilman Brancatelli, I thought I saw Councilman Cleveland's name pop up here too, who is also another board member. So thank you for the board members who attended this evening. In fact, I think Dale Miller was on here as well, who was another board member. So I'm just sort of seeing some of your names here in the background on the chats and such. So thank you very much for participating in the meeting this evening, but more importantly, participating in the work that we do and setting the direction for us as staff to be able to bring to you this kind of analysis. Councilman Miller over in Councilman Miller from Cuyahoga County says he is still here. So thank you, Councilman Miller, for sticking around.
So I have no more questions in the chat. Looks like we have a couple minutes left. If I guess
to wrap it up.
Yeah.
So thank you all for your very, very thoughtful questions, your participation this evening. We thank you for your support in terms of helping us to think through the policy questions and think through the impacts and help us to ensure that if and when this policy is implemented, it's done so in a way that is very, very positive. And I do want to thank staff, Dr. Makarachi, Dr. McDonald, Kathy Sarley. You guys have done a terrific job in terms of looking at all of the elements and helping us put together this policy. Also Randy Lane, who I think is not in my panel, but also worked on that. And then Danielle Render and her team, who have done an outstanding job in putting together this public meeting this evening. Thank you very much. Again, this is a policy for you, so we want to make sure that we are transparent in putting it together and then deploying it. So keep in touch and let us know what you think. Great to hear from you, and thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.